Hello and welcome to Theotivity. My name is Thaddeus, and I'm glad that you've joined me for this kind of impromptu episode here. I've been thinking about doing a couple more episodes based on art and creativity. I mean, after all, Theotivity is the combination of theology and creativity, and one of my great passions is illustration. And I wanted to do a little bit of, a start into some mini tutorials on illustration, just to share some knowledge and hope that other artists can be inspired and perhaps gather some good tips to help them improve in their illustration. And in case you were wondering, yes, I am wearing a Captain Obvious, and perhaps it's a little bit appropriate maybe, because I think some of the tips that I'll be giving today on this illustration, may be a little bit obvious for illustrators who are a little bit more experienced and have been drawing for a while. But perhaps for beginners, it might be helpful to get some insight into how to get started and where you can improve in your drawing. So with that, I'd love to jump into today's illustration. One of the purposes of Theotivity actually is to bring together theology and creativity. So I actually did a series of little quick sketches, I guess, illustrations, portraits of what I call the Reformed preacher portraits. And I started off first with Mr. Paul Washer, and then with Dr. John MacArthur was one, Dr. John Piper was another, and I was gonna go through all of these different preachers that influenced me. Not all of them are formally reformed in the sense of being confessionally reformed, but they are, reformed-ish in their soteriology and so on. I do hold to the reformed tradition within Christianity. The 1689 London Baptist Confession is kind of what I hold to theologically. And there are many great other Reformed theologians that I'd love to get to draw. Guys like Dr. John Frame, for example, been very influential on my theology. Jonathan Edwards is a historical kind of guy. Sinclair Ferguson, G.K. Beale, Greg Bahnsen, Cornelius Van Til in terms of apologetics sort of stuff. Dr. Stephen Lawson, Vodi Bakum, Conrad Mbewe, just so many really solid preachers within the Reformed tradition of the faith that have really blessed my walk and my understanding of God's word. So if you're a Christian, or even if you're not, feel free to look up some of those names and maybe check out some of their sermons and teachings online on YouTube. So let's jump on in. Today we're going to be looking at my drawing of Paul Washer, who is a Reformed theologian. So this is the finished drawing here of Paul Washer, and he's been really instrumental in my life as a Christian pastor, preacher, teacher, that sort of thing, evangelist. But he's been really influential. I actually was able to see him preach here in Toronto a couple of times, and to get to meet him and to just interact a little bit with him. He's an amazing guy, very humble, very helpful, very biblical, and has encouraged me a lot. So if you're a Christian artist or just an artist and you want to look up some of Paul Washer's sermons on YouTube, definitely check him out. He's got some great messages. He's given me really good clarity on the gospel. What is the gospel? This word is talked about a lot, about gospel, the good news, and there's many different people who have different ideas about what the gospel is, but Washer is really good in just unpacking the biblical gospel. What does the Bible mean by the gospel? What's the true call to repentance, to faith in Jesus Christ, and what does that mean on your life? I think he was really helpful for me, especially as a young man growing up and in the church and not really understanding that. What's the true call of Christ on my life? What does it mean to recognize Christ as Lord? And what does it mean to repent? So definitely check him out. But anyways, today we're going to go through this drawing that I did of him. You can see here on the left is the reference that I used to draw from here. Not a great reference in a sense of the resolution on it is not the best. As you can see, it's pretty pixelated, but it was good enough for me to get a good feel for Washer's face. And this was a pretty quick sketch. It wasn't a finished drawing by any means. Yeah, so still some things that I think I didn't quite hit on this in terms of proportions and so on. I think his head is actually a little bit wider than I drew it here. You can see from the reference, like the width of his head. I kind of got it wrong in terms of even like the distance between here and here, the ears, right? Between the ears. I think oftentimes artists make this mistake, even myself as I draw, where we kind of underestimate just how far that distance is. You can see in the reference there that is actually quite larger than what I drew it at. But all in all, I think it sort of looks like him. And I'm gonna go through the time lapse of this drawing and just kind of walk you through what was my thinking of it, and then I'll start going through some tips on how you can approach an illustration yourself. Now, the app that I used for drawing this particular illustration is called Procreate on the iPad. You probably know it already if you're an artist. If not, if you're just beginning and you're looking for a good iPad app to draw in, Procreate is really great. It is a paid app, but it's well worth it. You just pay once and you've got the app. Okay, so let's take a look at this time lapse of this drawing. So basically starting off with just a sphere to start off on the head. Right, that gives me some good proportions and just lays out kind of on the canvas where I want the head to be. And around that sphere, I'm going to start to lay in some of the main features of this particular portrait, right? And you can tell here that I'm starting off with the eyebrows and just laying in that hair shape. And at this point, I'm just looking for differences in shapes and so on, right? So for the nose and section, I'm just starting to lay that in terms of the shape of it. You can see just like a triangle there, right? And I'm trying to hit like the different planes of the face especially. So as I start laying in, for example, that eye that's in the background there, right? Like that eye here, right? As I'm doing that, I'm trying to make sure that I'm not drawing what my brain thinks is there, because often that's the problem, that as we illustrate, our brains fill in what we think should be there instead of drawing what's actually there. What I'm doing is looking at the reference and I'm seeing, oh, okay, just a little bit of his eye showing there. And I'm just actually focusing on drawing the shapes. Try your best as you illustrate to actually not think, hey, I'm drawing an eye right now. Draw the shapes that you see. So, and this is a really hard discipline to perfect as an artist, but it's what's going to help you to draw realistically and what's actually there. Is don't think, okay, I'm drawing an eye, but think, okay, this is the line that I see, this is the shape that I see, and this is how it relates to other shapes around it, right? Let me continue this. So you can see I'm starting to block in the eyes. Again, like if I was to block in these eyes as if I was thinking about drawing eyes, it probably wouldn't look like this. It would look like a caricature. Let me illustrate that for you right now, actually. So most people, as they draw, they aren't looking at the reference enough. And what they end up doing is actually drawing from their memory, right? They try to draw what they think an eye should look like. So usually they'll end up doing something like this, where they start to draw basically an almond shape, right? And just put the eye there. But that's not typically how human eyes look. It's actually quite more complex than that, right? An eye has a lot more different features and shapes and nuances, and the lines flow differently into each other. And also there's depth, there's roundness to the eye in terms of the shape of it. And you really go wrong when you start to draw from your memory. So if I was to do the same with that Paul Washer eye, so let me erase this, I probably wouldn't have drawn the shapes that I drew, which was, it sort of looked like that, right? Like almost like a side view. But that's not quite what the eye looks like there. There's the inner part there, right? That should be there. You got to think of the sphere of the eye that's around there. And then the lids are going to go around that sphere, right? So there's going to be some roundness to it as well. And then also similarly on the bottom side of it, right? And then you got to think, okay, well, the lids underneath also need to wrap around that eye. And then the lids on top need to wrap around that sphere as well. And then as you draw in that crease that's above as well, that's going to also have to wrap around that eye shape, right? So I hope you see that, what you need to do is actually look at your reference really intently and try not to draw what you think you see or what you think should be there, but do your best to discipline yourself not to think I'm drawing an eye or I'm drawing a nose or whatever it is, but just to draw the lines and the shapes that you see. And what is the length of that line? What is its relationship to other lines around it? What is the shapes that it makes, both in terms of positive shapes and negative spaces? I'll talk more about that later. Okay, so for example, if you're laying out the shapes of the face here for Mr. Washer, what I would look at as I'm looking at my reference, and again, you're trying to discipline your mind, discipline your mind not to think in terms of I'm drawing a nose, I'm drawing an eye, or whatever it is. Think in terms of shape. So I'm going to look at, for example, first his nose, right? His nose now looks like, okay, it's got this sort of a downward trajectory, right? Like that. That's approximately the angle that it makes there. And then I'm going to start to look again at, okay, what's the angles that it makes there? And expect to be surprised. Oftentimes, as we draw, we're surprised by the shapes and the way that the lines relate to one another because it's not quite what we thought was there. So don't be afraid to be surprised. I'm gonna look at, okay, this is another line that's there. I'm gonna look at seeing, okay, about that far up the nose is the eye. Right, and it goes to about there. And then looking at, okay, eyebrow starts about there. Angle again that goes down, it's about there, right? Where in relation to the nose does the eye start? So you can draw kind of like a line down from there, because you can see in the reference here, right? The reference, his eye starts about where the edge of his nose ends here, right? So you can use construction lines as you draw and then erase them later. I didn't for this particular drawing because it was a quick sketch, but as you're drawing, you can use construction lines to help you out. So one of the lines that would be helpful is just to draw an eye line, right? So that goes between both eyes. That way you know that your eyes aren't like, on different levels, right? But as you do that, and again, you can break this down into its most simple sort of shapes. Like if I was to just simplify that eye, I think it would look something like that almost, right? And here, this eye almost can't see it at all, right? It would be more like that. And then you can continue to refine that. Oops. And again, I'm trying my best not to think, okay, I'm drawing a mouth right now, but I'm just looking at lines. I'm trying to replicate those lines. That's probably one of the most difficult disciplines in art, is actually to just discipline your mind not to think in terms of, okay, I'm drawing a mouth, I'm drawing an eye, I'm drawing a whatever body part it is, because then you'll default to trying to draw a caricature of what's there as opposed to what's actually there. Now, this is really hard for me to do as I talk because it's actually engaging two different parts of my brain. This is why art tutorials are actually quite hard to do. And this is actually why, as you draw, you should try not to listen to music with words. At least for me, that's really unhelpful. You see, as we draw, we're actually using the right side of our brains, which it deals with spatial perception, it deals with creativity, it thinks kind of non-linearly, it thinks in terms of three-dimensional space and so on. And that's really good for doing art. But again, because the artistic side of our brain is our right side, but our linguistic side of our brain tends to be our left side, if you start to try to talk while you draw, you'll very quickly find it very difficult, as I'm finding it difficult right now. Likewise, if you're listening to music with words and your brain starts to think in words, it will take you out of your right brain space and into your left brain space. So that's a quick tip for if you're an artist out there who struggles a lot with trying to get into that zone. I know artists just have if you're an artist and you've been drawing for a while, you know that there's this zone that we just get into where you lose all conception of time, right? And you just get lost in your art, and for some reason things flow and just work a lot better. Well, that's because you're actually operating in your right brain space. The right brain can't tell time. This is why you'll start an art project and be working on it for hours and hours and forget to eat. And all of a sudden it's like, 2 a.m. in the night. It's because the right brain doesn't know how to tell time. And you want to stay in your right brain as you're drawing because that's the side of your brain that deals with spatial perception, which is really, really important for this type of work. And also why it's really, really hard for me to draw and talk at the same time. Perhaps in future videos, I'll record over the video instead of trying to do it live like this. Oh, also, as you're drawing, think in terms of drawing negative spaces as well as positive spaces. What do I mean by that? Well, a positive space would be like this, right? So a nose, right? Like if I was to think of this as a positive space, that would be the positive space of the nose. It's kind of this triangle, right? That's there. A negative space would be, what is the shape that is created by the lack of something there. So this sort of thing, right? So let me use a different color, right? So here would be your negative space. So as you're drawing, think about, okay, what's the shapes that this negative space actually makes? And it's a way to check your drawing, because we tend to only focus our brains on the positive spaces. But by looking at the negative spaces as well and making sure that, okay, this line that this negative space makes here and the shape that it makes, does that match what's in my reference, right? So here on Mr. Washer, as you look at the negative space of that brick, right, at the background, right? What's the shape that that makes, and does it match the shape that you ended up with here as you were drawing, right? That's a great way to check your work. Continue to just rough in some of these shapes here. I'm looking at, okay, what's the relationship here of his nose to his two eyes, right? Like what's the angles that those create? Like, for example, the angle of his nose bridge. What's the slope that goes down? As you draw the mouth, now I did that pretty quickly. Let me rewind it a little bit for you. Notice again that you're looking at the shapes of the mouth that you see and trying to draw that, right? So obviously this picture is pretty pixelated, but I can see here that there's a shape that this mouth makes. I'm trying to break it down into its constituent shapes, right? Just think geometrically. And you'll see as I draw it, right, that I'm just drawing shapes. And again, in my mind, I'm not thinking I'm drawing a mouth, but I'm just looking at, okay, what are the shapes that I see? What are the lines that I see? And I'm trying to replicate those. Then I go on here to the chin, and you can see as I'm doing this, I'm starting to fill in a little bit of shading. I'm not focusing yet on a lot of the details of the shading, but I'm just blocking in shapes here. Blocking in the ear. Ears are, again, another thing that a lot of people get a lot of trouble with. So let me go over the ear again. Again, as you're drawing ears, don't think, okay, I'm drawing an ear right now, but look at the lines that you see in your reference and then draw those, right? So pretty rough. Like, my sketches usually are pretty free and loose. I don't yet have controlled lines at this point, but I'm just trying to get the likeness down. At this point now in the drawing, I'm starting to add in a little bit of shading, starting to look at, okay, where in this this photograph am I seeing light and shadow, right? And particularly, I'm starting off firstly with shadows, because for me that's helpful, looking at the shadow spaces first. And you can see also I've changed my background to gray, and that's just because that mid-tone gray gives me something in the middle, right, as a default sort of value. And then I can go darker from that and then lighter above that. So again, continuing now to put in a little bit more shadow shapes here. Starting to get in some of the beard. He's got a nice salt and pepper beard. I love that. I can't wait till I hopefully can grow one myself. I mean, I'm almost 40, but those Asian genes, man, like, can't grow a beard. And at this point, I'm using the broad side of my pencil to just lay in those shapes, right? So at this point, I've got the Apple Pencil. Instead of holding it, tipped down like this, I'm holding it on its side and starting to shade like that to get those broad shapes for shading. And then you'll see the next phase here is I'm going to start to block in some of the highlights. And again, in this sketch, at this point, it should look fairly like your reference. I think right now, got a pretty decent likeness of Mr. Washer. And as you could see, in terms of switching to that mid-tone gray, right? This is why I love this, and you can replicate this drawing on like some sort of toned paper, or maybe if you're doing it in Procreate, just start with a 50% gray canvas, and that gives you the flexibility that you can now go below that in terms of your values for shadows, right? And then above that for your highlights, and that's really useful because if you just draw on white paper, for example, which most people do, you're starting at your highest value or your brightest value. And then all you can do from there is just go below it in terms of shadow. And it doesn't give you a whole lot of flexibility. It also doesn't give you a whole lot of give in terms of just being forgiving if you make mistakes. Because if you start off with your highest value and you only can go below it, if you smudge something, make a mistake or whatever, I mean, I guess you could go over it with some chalk or something to try to bring back some of the highlights. But I find anyways that it's harder to undo mistakes like that. Whereas if I start with a mid-tone gray paper and let's say I go a little bit too dark in some areas, when I do my highlight pass with my chalk or my white pencil, I can now go over those areas just lightly and bring back some of those shadows, right? So that I can correct for mistakes. And that's also why I usually will start with my dark tones first and then go to my light tone. Starting to add some of the highlights to him. And this is what really starts to bring this drawing alive, right? You're looking at, okay, what are the highlights I see in my reference? And I'm starting to add that into this sketch. Now, at this point here, I'm not drawing every single strand of his hair. I just want to get a general gist of his hair. So, yes, I'm doing some strand work, but for the most part, I'm, again, using the broad side of my pencil and just laying in those tones over top the dark tones that I drew before it. So I hope that somebody here found that helpful. I hope that you picked up maybe some little tips, some quick tips from this sort of impromptu little tutorial here on illustrating. And I hope that somebody perhaps goes and looks up some Paul Washer videos and maybe is blessed by his preaching and his message and his teachings and so on. Again, I found him very helpful for myself. But in terms of illustration, again, these are just little quick tutorial videos that I'm hoping to do a little bit more of. If you enjoyed this, please leave a comment below. If you learned something new, please tell me. And if you've got some questions or would like some future sort of tutorials on illustration, I'd love for you to give some input. Please feel free to leave a comment below. And if you like this, please share it. And hope to see you again soon on Theotivity, and we'll do some more drawing and art together. Also, check out the website at theotivity.com. Here, right? And check out the articles and resources there. I try my best to do some good research and to give you guys some solid theology to help you to grow in your faith and also to inspire your creativity as well, because we can't help but create out of our theology. Everybody's a theologian. It's only a question of whether we a good one or not. Until next time, Soli Deo Gloria.